Unisocc was a key partner with Human Rights Watch and Athletes Save Japan on our July 2020 report documenting taibatsu and other forms of abuse in more than 50 sports in Japan. This report brought us together for a regular lecture series with Unisocc, and now the Professional Footballers Association co-CEO, Kate Gill, is our first outside speaker. In my last part of my introduction before we interview Kate Gill, I do want to say a few words about the current situation of sport and society in Japan. But I think that former Prime Minister Mori's comments that women talk too much and they should not be in boards or important federations shows that there may be a pandemic of sexism in Japan. So tonight, or today, sorry, it's your day, my night. In our conversation with Kate, we want to look at to do a comparison with Japan, Australia, the US, and other countries about how gender equality is treated in sport. And are there some ways, can we use the Olympics? Can we use the Women's World Cup that is coming up in Australia and New Zealand in 2023 to make tangible progress in advancing women's rights? I was working on a metaphor for you being a striker and then transitioning to a striker for equitable pay.
I like that one.
So a little background for our audience. Kate also led the push for W League players to organize for better wages and conditions, and struck this landmark, what's called a collective bargaining agreement. And Kate, can you tell us a little bit about that process? How did you negotiate for pay?
Yeah, so we started that process. It was very much focused around the players and their experiences as footballers within the Australian domestic space. And we did an extensive research piece, which kind of unraveled their situations and their circumstances. And it didn't make for good reading. And we were very vocal about that. And we made this report public. So we then sat down with the Football Australia, which is the governing body for football here in Australia. And we had a very frank conversation with them. We said, you can either do something about this and we can change the circumstance for these players, or it's going to be a public campaign that we will run and it won't look pretty. So to be able to have the players backing in support through that process is what has then led to renewed conditions and improvement each year.
So I wanted to, our audience, we have about 40 people on the call, and many of them may not understand what is a collective bargaining agreement. Could you explain that? And how do athletes, a collective bargaining agreement is something that unions use to negotiate better pay or conditions. Can you tell us how athletes can use such things to advocate for rights?
Yes, so we're fortunate here and in Australia that we have the PFA, which is the Players Union. So our main role is to negotiate the collective conditions for professional footballers. And in that cohort, we have our A-League and W-League players, which are in the domestic space. And then we have the Matildas and the Socceroos, which operate on a national playing field. So by having that support from the union, we liaise with the players. They are members of our association, and we talk with them directly and constantly to work out their state of play. So the issues and challenges that they're facing. And then on behalf of them, we enter into discussions with the national body, which is Football Australia. And at the moment, we now have a professional leagues entity that has just taken over the role of the professional game. So they're the two main negotiating bodies that we talk directly with about what the players would like to see in their employment contracts.
And Kate, I wanted to, you have many Japanese female soccer players or football players and male players here with us. And in many places around the world, professional women's players have not been treated as professionals. They're not paid as professionals, and you had to fight for a minimum salary and medical care. Could you tell us a little bit about that fight and what your role in it was?
Yeah, I think the main catalyst for the change was in 2015 when the current group of Matildas, their collective bargaining agreement had expired. So this meant that they were in a position where their contracts were no longer valued or valid, and we were in a negotiation process at that time. And the players were putting on the table a deal that was well researched. It was a sound position. They thought it was fair and reasonable. But of course, the Federation had other ideas. So there was essentially a stalemate that went on. And the catalyst to this was that the Matildas were set to fly out to go and play against the US women's national team. And as a player, that's a game that you don't take lightly. That's something you want to be involved in. But instead, the players made the decision, because the negotiations had broken down, to effectively go on strike and not participate in that event. And it definitely brought things to a head. It was quite globally received. There was a lot of media attention around it. And this is what kind of changed, I guess, the view of the Matildas and where they stood, especially in terms of the public perception of them within Australia. So that was the main kind of catalyst that brought about the change.
Arigato. So I want to go now to a few. We got some amazing questions in advance of your talk tonight from Unisocc. They've collected some questions, and I think within Japan there are a lot of questions about. The first question I want to ask you is, what is equality? And the question is, how can we explain such a basic concept to those who are indifferent to it, so that they can easily understand?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And when I get asked this, I always think about equality and equity. And there's a great visual representation that I go to. It's, if you can picture people standing on a box trying to look over a fence. And if someone's taller than somebody else, they're going to be able to stand on that box and look over that fence. But if someone's a little bit shorter, their box needs to be a little bit higher. So it's not about lowering this level down to the lowest common denominator. It's about bringing the two levels up to match each other. So I think that provides the visual representation of what equity and equality is about.
And I just wanted to say that, so the problems that Kate had to overcome in Australia are very common around the world. So Human Rights Watch has interviewed, I have interviewed players from Puerto Rico, from Haiti, from the Netherlands, from Canada, and from the United States, who have all had to fight for pay. In some cases, they have to fight for medical care, even if they are injured in playing. So I wanted to ask a question. This is another Unisocc question, but it is, how can equality or gender equality and equal pay be realized in sport worldwide?
Yeah, it's a very, very great question. The model that we built with our gender equality framework is universal in a football sense. And I'll try and unpack that a little bit for you. And what I mean by that is the model works in that it's a revenue share. So the money that comes into Football Australia is then divided up equally and given to the Socceroos and Matildas in equal amounts. Now, the way that the money is divided between the two teams is based on the circumstance. For instance, our female players need a contract. They need 12 months worth of payment and protection, whereas our male their male counterparts who have quite lucrative club contracts can survive when they come into camp, they will get paid. So they pretty much get paid to play, whereas the girls are looked after for a whole year. Mm-hmm. And in saying that, I think that this can be translated to every federation within football, because the way that the economics in the game work is that the domestic side of the game and the club competitions for the men is very, very lucrative. So it would be very, very easy to adapt this to be able to look after the female players holistically for 12 months, and then for the men to be looked after when they come into their national team setups. Now, I know this doesn't solve all the problems for sport, but I think if we can build a model that has universal principles built into it, then that's something that we can translate no matter where it's implemented.
I will never forget, I interviewed Prince Ali of Jordan, who sat for many years on the FIFA executive board. And he told me that many of the women's national team players in Jordan are also doctors or lawyers or professors. And I said, that's amazing. I said, what about the men? And he said, no, the men are paid as professional football players. The women have to work as doctors so that they can afford to play football. Mm. And he also said there are some players who work multiple jobs just to get on the soccer pitch, on the football field.